Welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Queenship Studies Across the Medieval Mediterranean and Western Europe. My name is Miriam Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute, and I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of Al-Mazak, which is the journal of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. It's a fantastic journal. Subscription comes as part of the membership of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, and I think Antonella will advertise the society a bit more later. This is the third seminar in a series of collaborations between the Wolf Institute and the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. And we now also have found some new partners in the series. We have new partners on board, CSIC IMF, the University of Liège, and the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln. Antonella will talk about the society a bit later, but I want to talk a bit about the Wolf Institute for those who do not know the Institute. We are a research institution. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our research with teaching, with public education, and with policy work. Most of our research is concerned with contemporary social sciences, but we also understand the importance of historical research, and we have quite a few of our students and affiliated researchers working on historical themes, including myself. So a very quick introduction of how this webinar works. We've already sort of skimmed through the names popping up on our Zoom audience list, and we have quite a few colleagues and students in attendance. It's really, really nice to have you all here. We're also live streaming via Facebook. If you want to rewatch this or recommend watching it to anyone, you can do that. The videos are available from the Wolf Institute Facebook page and also from our YouTube channel very shortly. So for the structure of this webinar tonight, we'll have a panel discussion about 20-25 minutes. So each speaker has been asked to prepare 7, 8 minutes of introduction to that topic, and then we'll have a short discussion among ourselves while you can prepare questions for the Q&A session afterwards. You can type your question in the Q&A portal on the bottom of your screens. It makes it easiest for us. It's easier there than if you put them in the chat just for the management of the questions. And it's the right time now to introduce our chair, Dr. Antonella Liuzzo-Scorpo from the University of Lincoln, who works on the cultural history of Iberia. And I'm handing over to you, Antonella.
Thank you, Miriam. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this first seminar for this new series that we're really pleased to host. So before I introduce the speakers, just a few words about the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, in case you don't know it already or you are not already members. And if you are not, what best Christmas present than to yourself than becoming a member of the society? Disclaimer, this is advertisement. So the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, as you know, is dedicated to the academic study of Mediterranean history and culture from the 5th to the 15th century, and it aims to foster cross-cultural and interdisciplinary investigation and to really bring scholars together. And one of the aims of the society is always to try to actually bring together scholars at different stages of their careers. And in fact, we also tend to support early career scholars, postgraduate students, also with a number of scholarship and prizes. You might have seen recently the advertisement for the application open for the new Simon Barton Conference Prize for postgraduate students and early career scholars. We also have a book prize and an article prize that normally get then awarded during our international conference that runs biannually, although without naming the usual pandemic, obviously has been postponed for this year, but the next one will be in Crete, and so keep an eye on that as well. And Miriam has also mentioned the fact that obviously the society is linked to Al-Mazak, the journal, and we also invite your submission for that too. So to go for what is today's session about. Is a panel on queenship studies across the Mediterranean and Western Europe. And speaking of early career scholars, today we have two members of our medieval studies research group cohort at the University of Lincoln, and I'm going to introduce them one by one just before they speak. And they're going to present their own project, their own research, but addressing queenship studies, therefore, through the perspective of their own research, and then trying to open the debate and the floor for questions later on. So we start with Paula. Paula del Val Valles is a first-year PhD student with us at the University of Lincoln, and her thesis is a comparative study on the Queen's household in the 13th century, and she's comparing Aragon, Castile, and England, with a particular focus on the unedited wardrobe and household accounts of Eleanor of Provence, Queen of England. She got her BA in history at the Complutense in Madrid, and then she moved on to this rainy place, and she did her MA in medieval studies at King's College. She's also a member of the Spanish research group Monarcas, and she also is a member of the Young Researchers Association, the Asociación Jimena. So without further ado, I leave this now to Paula.
Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, Miriam, and the organization for the invitation, and especially Antonella and Anais for preparing this session. I am really pleased to be with them today. And I will try to keep my presentation relatively short, as I'm looking forward to discussing it further during the debate. I'm going to share my screen now. Let me see, can you see it? Yep, okay. Yep. Well, during the following minutes, I want to briefly introduce a topic that has generated a progressively growing interest within the English historiography, but also within the Spanish and Portuguese scholarship, which is the study of the Queen's household in the Iberian medieval kingdoms, particularly Castile and Aragon. Many of the recent congresses and events around monarchy, such as the last Kings and Queens Conference or Monarchy and Money, had several papers or panels exploring this topic. Likewise, there is a growing body of secondary literature on the matter. However, the majority of these studies have tended to focus on late medieval queens. And some questions that may be popping into your minds as I say this is, well, whether Iberian queens just did not have an establishment and a court of their own until the late Middle Ages, or if they did have their own household before then, whether primary sources have survived or not. And the answer to the first question is that Aragonese and Castilian queens did indeed have a household separate from the king ever since the last decades of the 12th century. In Castile, there is historiographical consensus around the fact that Leonor Plantagenet was the first queen to have a household of her own. And in Aragon, although some authors have sustained that there is no such a thing until the reign of Jaume II during the last decades of the 13th century, the origin of this institution remains until this day highly unknown and understudied. What or which are the key signs that enable us to prove the existence of a separate household, especially during this formative and experimental century, is to bear a topic for me to discuss now, and maybe we could perhaps examine it further during the Q&A. But I've included here an image of Sancha of Castile, Queen of Aragon, since it is possible to find mentions to the Queen's separate personnel as early as during her reign. And thus, during the 13th century, we witnessed the appearance and formation of an increasingly separate and autonomous body of officials and resources that would progressively become the Queen's household and, in some instances, her own power base. Yet, it is undeniable that the extant sources for the 12th and 13th centuries are nowhere near the surviving material that is available for the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. However, and although scarcer and more scattered, there are some primary sources that for the 13th century, for the study of the Queen's household in particular, and the extant material includes, but is not limited to, chronicles, legal treatises, chancery records, and I've included just some examples here on this slide. But what I really like to further explore are the possibilities that chancery records in particular can offer to the study of queenly establishments and which key information we may encounter in each of them. And well, it goes without saying, but the chancery records were produced by the chancery, which is the institution in charge of the expedition, signing and sealing of documents. And first of all, I'd like to begin by highlighting the importance of the extant documents produced by the Queen's own chancery when these have survived, since they are quite rare for the 13th century. And the Queen's own chancery only appears in an on and off basis during this period, and it does not develop as a permanent institution for the Queen's consort until the late Middle Ages, unlike what happened in other northern kingdoms, such as England, for example. And this document I selected here was created by Egidius, who was Leonor Plantagenet's chancellor. Here we can read Egidius Regine Cancellarius, that's why I've highlighted it. And it's an 1179 document, which was discovered by José Manuel Cerda and Félix Martínez, and they published it in 2019. And it is held in a private archive, being in fact one of the only two surviving documents from Leonor's own chancery. If we move on to the documents produced by the Royal Chancery, I'd like to highlight marriage contracts or documents that record the dower and dowry of the Queen. The dowry being brought by the bride to the marriage, usually paid by her father or her family, and the dower being the endowment made by the bridegroom to his future wife. And as many historians have asserted already, these are highly interesting documents, but can also be very puzzling as they may vary greatly from kingdom to kingdom. In general terms, the queens only had access to their dowries during their widowhood, and the degrees of access to the lands and rents granted to them upon the betrothal could also vary. Although in Castile, it was customary for the queens to have access to them throughout their lives. And if you're interested on medieval views on this topic, I suggest checking the 13th century legal treaty by Alfonso X, Las Siete Partidas. I've included here an English edition and selected which title and laws in particular tackle this issue. And another key record that can provide a great insight into the emerging autonomous queenly households are the Queen's Wills. These contain not only mentions to their own resources, rents, lands, or even debts, but also to the projects, their personal initiatives, as well as to the personnel they wish to compensate or reward for their service. I've included here an extract of the will of the Queen of Aragon, Violante of Hungary, from 1251, as well as an image of her daughter's will. Her daughter was Violante of Aragon, Alfonso X's wife and Queen of Castile, and her will is dated in 1292, 8 years before her death in the 1300s. And finally, I'd like to draw your attention more generally into the witness lists that we can find in royal documents, monastic records, among others, as this can include mentions to the Queen's officials and personnel, which are of great value to the study of their households. On the left, I've selected an extract from a donation made by the Catholic King of Aragon, which includes his mother Sancha's mayordomo as a witness, mayordomo or butler, Lupus de Valterra Mayordomus Domine Regine. And on the right, the other document I've included here was produced in the monastery of Las Huelgas de Burgos, which, as many of you may know, was founded by Alfonso VIII and Leonor Plantagenet. And this document is a donation made by the abbess of the monastery to one of Leonor's officials, where Leonor herself, as well as her chaplain and notary, appear as witnesses. Domina Regina Alienor, as we can see here, and also Petrus, Domine Regine Capellanus et Notarius. And as a final remark, I'd like to say that the sources I have presented this afternoon are far from being unknown to historians, and I'm sure many of you in the audience are familiar with them and probably know about them a lot more than I do. But what I hope I've been able to highlight is the particular interest they can entail for the study of queenly households, especially in the 13th century, for when sources and mentions to this institution are way less straightforward and less systematic than for later times. This is precisely the topic my thesis aims to explore, comparatively with the extant material from 13th century England. And thank you all so very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions, comments, as well as to the debate. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you, Paula. That was really, really interesting. So we now follow with Anais before then starting the Q&A session. So the second speaker for today is Dr. Anais Wag, who's also the mind, by the way, behind this session, and is also one of the organizers of this series on behalf of the Medieval Studies Research Group at Lincoln. And she's, in fact, a Liverhome Early Career Fellow with us at Lincoln, where she started in September her new project entitled Female Royal Rulership in Theory and Practice, Queens Regnant from 1109 to 1328, which is a comparative study of the earliest female claims to medieval thrones across Western Europe and the Mediterranean. Anais completed her BA in history at Fordham University in New York, and then she also moved to London, where I guess she met Paula. In fact, she also completed her MA at King's College, sorry, in London. And she was awarded actually her PhD earlier this year with a thesis on forms and formalities in 13th century queenship, a comparative study. So, as I said, I just leave these to Anais to tell us a little bit more about her project and about some of the key questions that I think we need to debate today.
Thank you, Antonella, and thank you, Miriam, and the Society for Medieval Mediterranean for the invitation to speak today. And thank you to Paula, who is actually helping me with my slides. So I'm going to speak about my Leverhulme project today. As many here know, over the last 50 years, studies of medieval queenship have explored and demonstrated the political participation of royal and aristocratic women. In doing so, these have provided a new framework for the study of power, one which rightly broadens power beyond its direct and public exercise within the context of law and force. This new framework for power has itself led to a reconsideration of medieval monarchy as more than simply the rule of one man, the king, but rather as a family institution. Such studies, focused primarily on queen's consort and the related roles of regent and dowager, have foregrounded the often gendered nature of medieval power, associating its direct and public exercise with men and kings as rulers, while associating another type of power, often indirect and delegated, with women and queens as consorts and mothers. Less frequently examined is the position, perception, and actual power of the women who claimed the title of ruler in their own right. As rulers positively sanctioned by God and frequently legitimized by a coronation ritual, a queen regnant was allegedly the equivalent to a king. The reality of medieval attitudes towards women and female rule, however, meant that a queen regnant's power, in practice, was not quite on par with that of a king's, even though in theory it should have been. It is clear that the experience and exercise of power of a queen regnant was decidedly different from those of a king. But they were also decidedly different from those of a consort. The relationship and tensions between theory and practice of female rule are at the core of my project. So between 1109 and 1328, when the direct Capetian line was extinct and the Salic law was supposedly invoked to unequivocally bar women from the French throne, a total of 15 royal heiresses either asserted claims or were acclaimed to the thrones of Aragon, Castile and Leon Castile, England, France, Jerusalem, Navarre, Portugal, Scotland, and Sicily, with varying degrees of success. In chronological order, these women are Urraca of Leon Castile, Teresa, Countess of Portugal, and later self-proclaimed Queen of Portugal, Melisende of Jerusalem, Empress Matilda, Lady of the English and claimant to the English throne, Petronilla, Queen of Aragon and Countess of Barcelona, Sibylla of Jerusalem, Isabella I of Jerusalem, Constance I, Queen of Sicily and Holy Roman Empress, Maria of Montferrat, Queen of Jerusalem, Berengella, Queen of Castile and Consort of Leon, Isabella II of Jerusalem, Constance II of Sicily, consort of Aragon and claimant to the Sicilian throne, Juana I of Navarre, also consort of France, Margaret, Maid of Norway, and finally Juana II of Navarre and claimant to the French throne. These 15 claims were made to thrones in 9 kingdoms, which, as you can see in the map in the slide, were largely clustered around the Mediterranean, though not solely. The aim of this project is to undertake a comparative study of female rulership in the Middle Ages, a phenomenon that is generally associated with the early modern period, and in particular with the reigns of Isabella I of Castile and Elizabeth I of England. The life experiences and political careers of these royal heiresses will offer significant case studies to explore how the earliest claims to medieval royal thrones were handled, under which circumstances these women succeeded and failed to achieve their claims, and what political traditions played a role in these developments. As regnants, the women of this study wielded or attempted to wield direct and public power as kings, rather than indirect and delegated power as queen's consort. This study examines women as rulers and how their exercise of power and authority compared to that of their contemporary male rulers and female consorts. Examining their power comparatively and through the prism of gender will help identify not only the structural patterns in women's exercise of power, but also the customs, practices, and political ideas of female rulership across Latin Christendom. An additional aim is to assess the extent to which attitudes towards female rulership differed according to political, legal, and cultural contexts. For instance, within the Iberian Peninsula, where the first female claims emerged, views appeared to be exceptionally accommodating towards female royal rulership. The objective of the study is threefold. The first is to identify and analyze contemporary law of succession and legal foundation upon which female claims rested. The second is to explore how such claims played out in practice, assessing different historical, political, and legal contexts comparatively to identify both commonalities and differences. And third, to understand the practice of medieval female rulership and how it compared to that of kings and consorts, by considering what strategies female rulers adopted to express and exercise their power, and how their contemporaries perceived, conceived, and reacted to their actions. I would like to end with a note on my methodology. My comparative and interdisciplinary methodology combines developments in political history, gender studies, queenship studies, legal studies, diplomatics, and medieval literature. Building upon the existing biographical, dynastic, and regional scholarship on queens regnant, which I am ever so grateful for, this project will address important questions regarding regnants' access to and exercise of power. Medievalists have noted the need to identify and examine the political situations and the life circumstances surrounding each royal heiress's claim to understand why they succeeded or failed. This is what my project strives to accomplish in a comparative manner, kind of bringing all these women together and looking at them comparatively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anais. That was very, very great. So just a note to all the attendees, please do feel free to ask your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon that you can see at the bottom of your screen, so that we can clearly see that those are questions rather than putting them on the chat. And Miriam, I don't know if there are any questions on Facebook that you might want to. They're not at the moment. Okay, so first of all, while we wait maybe for questions to arrive on the Q&A, oops, if this managed to close, yes. Maybe I can start by asking Paula and Anais to comment upon exactly what seems to be at the core of both their research projects, and is the comparative approach. That is an interesting, certainly an interesting one, a challenging one as well. And so I was wondering whether you can talk a little bit more about the, first of all, the criteria that are behind the choices that informed your selection of studies, and how, basically, if you want to talk a little bit more about your comparative methodology and how that has worked out until now.
Anais, are you happy to start? Or?
No, you can go first if you like. Or, yeah.
Well, in my case, in terms of how did I get to that topic, it was more by chance, in a sense. I started in England. I started in Spain studying queenship, and then once I went to England and I found out about this wonderful queen, Eleanor of Provence, that I had not heard about, and I got I got to know all the extant records that are available, which I didn't have the impression that was the same here, at least for the 13th century. That's what got me intrigued. And I think it is, in fact, as you said, in the core of my project, that comparative approach. Because on the one hand, I don't think it is, and I may want to comment about this, what is customary to begin a project thinking about it comparatively, and rather we start working on a single queen, and then we try to put that into conversation with what's happening around us. Whereas I think the Queen's household is a really great topic to start thinking and shaping the whole process of how we think about households in a comparative manner. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Paula.
I similarly fell in love with Eleanor of Provence. She is also my favorite queen. But I differently have kind of always thought of my approach comparatively. I think I find comparison easier in that sense, and I do find that it's so. I personally feel that it's so essential to fully understanding the complexities, especially of something like queenship, which is a medieval phenomenon. We see it obviously queens throughout the Middle Ages, but you know, what are the similarities and what are the differences? What are the commonalities? Yes, they're all wives of kings or queens in their own right, but it does vary from region to region, and yet there are also similarities. And I find that those are easier to identify when you really look at them together across the board and look at different areas. I mean, even within the Iberian Peninsula itself, which has a lot of commonalities, differences as well. So yeah, I feel like I think I find comparative history easier, so I've defaulted to it, but I do think it's also really rewarding, and you get a lot from it. Yeah.
Thank you, Anais. So we've got two questions in the chat. Surprise, surprise, from two Queen's experts. So Therese is, first of all, thanking the speakers, but also asking specifically, Anais, if you could explain a little bit more your point about Iberian exceptionalism.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I was hoping would come up in our discussion, and I think it is part of the comparative element of my thesis as well, is that there seems to be in the historiography a strain of how Iberian queenship is different, which it is. I mean, queenship in every region is different, but kind of uniquely so and in a very different way. And I think that this is true of some elements of queenship, but not all elements of queenship. And that this just needs to, I think this needs to be explored more in the historiography. For example, when I was doing my thesis, my PhD thesis, I looked at how queens consorts are mediated, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I would like to go back. There's this idea that Iberian queens had more power because they, within the Iberian Peninsula, and this is largely, I think, because they are more visible within royal documents. And this is because of how documents are phrased, and the intitulatio and such is always plural, this idea of the plural monarchy that characterizes especially the Iberian monarchies. And while I think that there is a difference, in my thesis, I looked at documents issued by all these consorts, and even these Iberian queens that are included in these plural formulations, documents on their own are still mediated by their spouses. So I guess I'm interested in exploring a bit more, what is it about Iberian queenship that is different and exceptional beyond just the fact that they are more present in the documents than their northern counterparts? Because this formulation doesn't even really appear in Aragonese documents in the same way. So therefore, can it really be an Iberian trait. I hope that answers the question. Paula, you might have something to add to that.
I was going to say, may I come in? I think also, well, I've already talked about this with you privately because we are obviously friends and interested in the same topic. But the particularity about households, I think, and how interested in can be to think about this Iberian singularity or exceptionalism, if you like, is how, although my project aims to study the Castilian and the Aragonese sources, they have nothing to do in terms of how many they are and how systematic they are with England. And that is so interesting because there was this idea that from the 12th century on in the northern kingdoms, queens lose a little bit of their place within the monarchy, I think. And I think Eleanor of Provence and, well, Eleanor of Castile, the studies Parsons made of her household just show otherwise, and how fascinating it can be to see how households act or not as their power bases, to see how singular or not is queenship beyond queens regnant, which I like. When we were seeing your presentation, obviously there were many claimants in the Iberian Peninsula, and that is singular. But maybe from my perspective, I'm focusing more on queen's consort and studying the queenship of queen's consort to see up to what extent it was singular or not, their situation compared to the north. And in my case, particularly England, but I think it could apply to many of the other kingdoms.
Actually, to follow up on that point, if I may, Antonella, is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Just to say also that the fact that the Iberian Peninsula does have more claimants, like royal heiresses that claim the throne in their own right, is part of, I think, this narrative of the Iberian queenship being different. But what I'm hoping to explore in my project, and I might be wrong, but what I feel is that that is also largely circumstantial, and that Urraca is the first queen to become queen regnant, and controversial, but by all means successful. She didn't have to share power with a husband, with a son, and yet she sets this precedent. And yet later on you get Berenguela of Castile, who doesn't quite get to replicate this in the same way. And so some Iberian queens faced similar challenges to, say, Matilda, the Empress Matilda. So I feel like a lot of it also is circumstantial. And so anyway, that's just something I'm hoping to explore further as well, to question that a bit more.
Thank you. Extensive answer. Just to let you know, you have about 10 more questions to go.
So it's fine. I'm okay.
So the next one actually is for both of you again, and it's from Giske, who's asking about, what about material culture? Is this part of your project? So for Paula specifically, does material culture appear in the household records that you're looking at? And for Anais, is material culture part of your argument in addition to written sources? So if you could comment on that.
Well, in my case, if I may, I was in fact today reading this fascinating will that I'm wishing to explore further in maybe another conference, from Constanza of Aragon. And material culture is such a huge part of her household. Her will is, all of it talks about the importance that material culture has, what she's selling, what she's gonna give to her daughters, to the monasteries. And particularly right now, I am beginning to work with the sources, and I haven't quite fitted in material culture as part of my project yet, because I'm obviously just beginning with the thesis. But I am coming to realize just this particular document really enlightened me and opened my eyes to see how fascinating and interesting this is in terms of the materiality of the household. But also I think, for example, I'm really interested in queen's seals and how they're represented. I think that's something I'm definitely gonna try to incorporate into my thesis, because I think it's a key part of the household is also self-representation, material culture, what is the household, what is in the household. I think maybe this is something I might explore more for the English part with with Eleanor of Provence's household roles, but that's definitely something to take into consideration for sure.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very much going to be looking at material culture, especially for kind of the third part of the project, which is the elements of rulership of these queens. It's something that I'm relatively new to, so I'm still kind of trying to identify what I will be using and such, but I agree with everything Paula just said. I do think it is a central part of queenship, and something that I am looking forward to exploring further.
Thank you. And there's a forthcoming webinar on that with the same person who asked the question. Who's going to talk more about that. So watch this space. So another question is from Alessandro, who's asking specifically, Anais, do you have cases in which two queens of obviously different kingdoms communicate with each other for diplomatic reasons?
Yes. So I should say I've just started the Leverhulme project, so I'm still kind of in the historiography part of it, so not as deep in the sources yet. But in my doctoral thesis, I do look at the exchanges between Eleanor and Marguerite of Provence, who granted our sisters. So I guess that helps with it. But they both were key in helping the royalist cause during the Second Barons' War in England, and really kind of made a coordinated effort to recruit other people to help and contribute to the cause in some way. All we have that survive are their letters to Alphonse of Poitiers, but I assume there were a lot more. There's also, there's a letter that was supposedly sent from Berenguer of Castile to Blanche of Castile. So there are some instances of letters, but unfortunately not as many as I would like. And also what's clear from Eleanor's letters, Eleanor of Provence, she has over 200 letters survive. These women were writing a lot. They just haven't been saved to the same extent as men's letters, unfortunately.
Thank you, Anais. There's another question for you as well on actually the age of this claimant and what role that played. In particular, Juliana was wondering how you consider the age of these claimants and how they play in their claims. I'm thinking particularly of Juana or Jean II, who was a child when Louis X died and was mostly represented by her maternal family. So are there any similar cases in your corpus? Does age play an important role?
I still have to do more research on this, but I would assume age does play a huge role, particularly when claims don't quite go in women's favor. Another young claimant is Margaret, the Maid of Norway, but her situation is actually completely different. She's essentially the only direct descendant of the Scottish throne. So she's the daughter of the King of Norway. So the Scots kind of actively seek her out, and she dies at the age of 8 on her way to Scotland to be crowned. So her situation is different in that sense. But age definitely is a factor. I mean, in Urraca's case, she was a grown woman with a male heir, and I think that's a factor as well. If you are an adult and you have a male son who shows that the continuity will go on, I think that's also helpful. Same with Melisende, she was already married with a son. It's something I'm keen to explore further. This is just kind of the more superficial that I've established thus far.
Thank you. There's a question here for both our speakers from Alessandro, who is asking to what extent the queens were involved in the practical government of their realm. In other words, were these queens that you are studying, for example, instructed about the operation of their chancery, financial offices, and so on? Do sources and records tell us something about all that?
Should I start? Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, in my particular case, I am working mostly, if not all, well, all with queen consorts. So the particular practical government of the realm is not probably the case, because they don't get to be regnant, or some of them get to be regent, but that is not what I'm focusing most of, although there are for sure cases. Eleanor of Provence gets to be regent, sorry, I was gonna be regnant, regent. Berenguela of Castile, I work on her too. But in my case, I think despite that, maybe despite not being, I think, in the terms of what you're posing your question, in the practical government, they for sure are knowledgeable in the chancery, how it works and everything. Eleanor of Provence, in fact, in England, her officials are reporting directly to the exchequer, so they are not doing their own auditing in front of the king, as maybe like Eleanor of Castile did. Her own personnel is going to the exchequer and they are auditing everything internally. They are reporting to Eleanor, so there is no chance that she did not know of the functioning of these institutions. And also something that I think must be taken into consideration is the amount of time these queens spent apart from the king. And during those months, days, weeks, months, years, they didn't die, they survived, they kept their own household working, they attended the matters, they answered letters. So I do think they are very put into the, maybe if not practical governance, have a general understanding of it for sure, in my case.
I would only add that in the case of consorts, I agree that I think they can act as advisors as well, and you often get kind of references to particular actions by the king that have been done on their wife's council, on the queen's council, or on her request or such. So I think they are involved in, and I think that also relates to kind of this idea of plural monarchy that is more present in the Iberian historiography, but I do think really applies to medieval monarchy in general. Every person has their role and their place within the monarchy, and so just because the queen isn't contributing ruling over the realm in the same way as the king is, they are still doing their part to contribute to that overall, to the broader purpose of ruling the realm.
Yeah, and just like a quick thing I want to add is an example is, for example, the foundation of Las Huelgas de Burgos that I was just mentioning in my presentation. That is also part of a governing a realm, includes having an active religious life, and there are so many aspects and phases to rulership, and I totally agree with you, Anais, on that.
Thank you. There's another question for both of you. Okay, we should do these seminars earlier. From Nerea, who's asking whether you think that the power of the queens that you are studying is institutionalized or somehow publicly recognized, or on the contrary, if these powerful queens would be exceptional cases rather associated with their personality or aptitudes or some kind of exceptional historical circumstances, whether you can make that claim.
Well, in my case, so I have many women in my study, and I'm obviously not, I don't have the in-depth knowledge of each of them as if I were focusing on just one. So I may be surveying around 15 queens, I think. But the more I read about them, the more I find that everyone has like a very interesting or powerful, I don't like to use powerful, or publicly recognized moment at some point of their lives. So it does seem to me that the more I read, the less exceptions I find, and I get the feeling that obviously a strong personality, a good rapport between king and queen are key aspects, but we may tend to focus too much on the personality of the queen just because she's a female or she's a woman, whereas there are many other factors, as Anais said, maybe not as many records have survived, etc. And whereas, yeah, I think it can play a key role, I don't think having a public role is as exceptional or having a publicly recognized role, whether it be powerful in terms of what we consider powerful or not now, which is another huge topic of discussion that we could have. But I'm just thinking of examples: Leonor Plantagenet, Berenguer of Castile, Eleanor of Provence, Violante of Hungary, Violante of Aragon. I don't think these are queens that are being, like, no one is recognizing the power of all the contrary, in fact.
Yeah, and I think an important part is that we're still trying to figure out what exactly defines the institution of queenship, but because I don't think it's yet defined as kingship is, but queens were crowned. I mean, so they had it's an institution in the sense that they are invested with special power. What that power is depends largely on a queen's personality, as Paula said, her relationship with her spouse or her son, or the king. But the being crowned sets them apart from everyone else and puts them on the same level playing field as kings. So queenship is an institution in that sense. But then there's more wiggle room for what type of queen one can be.
Thank you. I think these has partially answered and partially clearly addressed one of the other questions that you had here that links to exactly what you've been talking about, because Stacy was asking Anais, but I think it's a question that applies easily to both, is how do you actually define power? So whether you can say a little bit more about the framework of power that you employ in your project, which I think is exactly what you've been talking about, but I wonder whether you had anything else to add on this point.
Well, in my case, I actually did a lot of research on what do you consider power during my undergrad dissertation, and Maria Jesus Puente has a wonderful article where she defines power, authority, and I think that can be very, very interesting. But I think to my own study, obviously this question was for Anais, but I'm gonna answer too. I am not exploring yet in terms of power. I am first trying to establish what is there. Is there a household? Is there personnel that works just for the queen? And then once as I'm going reconstructing this, I try to in a parallel way think, well, is this enabling her to achieve any of her own initiatives, goals, or not? And I'd rather think of my project in terms of seeing first what is the situation and then extracting these conclusions to see to what extent they may be powerful or not, especially being queen's consort. And what do I understand as powerful? To me, the ability for these queens to access resources and then to have, as Anna said, some wiggle room to make the decisions count, to make their opinions count, and to take their initiatives, making them go on. Not always successfully, but at least to have the possibility to trying to do it, whether they success or not, depending on the occasion.
I agree with Paula. I still get nervous kind of trying to think of how do I define power. And I think that what's so great about queenship studies especially is that the Middle Ages the Middle Ages has been studied and understood politically so in such male terms that queenship studies is really changing how we understand power. And power is no longer hard power, direct power. It's so much more complex than that. And I feel like all the queenship studies we have done and that are underway and such is just continuously expanding how we understand power. I would broadly agree with Paula's definition, but I always get a bit panicked about how do I understand power. But anyway, I'm gonna leave it at that. If that's okay.
Thank you, Anais. Thank you. There's another question. Well, there are more questions, but I don't know if we will have time to answer all of them within the hour we've got. But if not, please do stay sign in, because even if the live screening finishes, we can still hang on, hang out a little bit more in the Zoom room to answer some of these questions, let's say offline. I mean, we're still going to be online, but not live stream. So there's a question from Anna, who's asking whether you know whether there's anything in the sources that you're looking at that suggests that the women were prepared for rulership in the same way as male heirs did.
I am not there yet, but this is something I'm really curious about, and I don't have an answer yet. And that was actually something that I always found really interesting about consorts as well. And this idea that we see in the later Middle Ages, the mirrors of princes, and do we get those similarly for queens? I mean, most queens were princesses or of royal or aristocratic descent, so they would have presumably been prepared to in some way or another. But yeah, no, sorry, I don't have a better answer than that yet, but I will be looking at it, and I hope to have a better answer in the near future.
Well, I don't look at that documentation at all, so I won't be able to build upon what Anna said. Rather than, yes, I find it fascinating too. So I'm looking forward to see what Anna finds, and that way I can learn more.
Thank you. So there is another question from Chris, who is asking about, so from your comparative approach, from your comparative perspective, is actually questioning, have you found, and we kept saying how many things can be similar, but what are the actual, whether you find out already some of the differences in your initial views and initial comparison, say between Aragon and Castile, or between the Western and Eastern Mediterranean. So whether you have already spotlighted some of the main differences you've been looking at.
Well, in my case, yes, I have. On the first one, and so far the main one, because I'm starting with my literature review and my gathering of sources, is English sources are way more extant, and for just from Eleanor of Provence's reign, from her household, I'm examining around, I think it's up to 20 records, or 15 to 20 records that are from her own chancery. Whereas, as I explained briefly in my presentation, that's not the case for the Iberian kingdoms for the 13th century, that is to say, because in Aragon in the 14th and 15th century, there are amazing documents. Antonella knows about them a lot. But that is one first difference. A second difference that I've spotted so far, it would be that this might be a historiographical difference, but the 13th century Aragonese household, we know way less than 13th century in Castile, within Iberia, between Castile and Aragon. So there is it's already a known fact that Leonor Plantagenet had a household, and we know a lot about it. José Manuel Cerda has worked extensively on it, if you want to check anything else on that. Whereas in Aragon, we know a lot for the 14th centuries and the 15th centuries, as I say, because the records start there to be amazing and systematic and numerous. But, well, you can find mentions to the personnel as early as Sancha, and Sancha of Castile is in the 12th century. I think Martin is here in the audience, and as he says, she's a very understudied queen that deserves more attention, because there are many records. It's not like we may know more about how power is understood once we read those records, now that we're focusing on queens rather than kings or just kingship. I don't know if I answered. I went a little bit off topic, but
I'm still quite early on and haven't started too much of the comparative. I mean, what I can say that has been mentioned in a lot of the historiography on queen regnants kind of regionally is that one of the main factors to help a queen regnant kind of fulfill her claim is she needs to be married. There has to be a man who can kind of who is palatable to all the nobles of the kingdom, and this seems to be the case in every single case, except for Margaret, the Maid of Norway. I think, I'm sorry, I'm not 100% sure. So in my experience, comparison can often actually highlight more similarities than differences, but then it helps to kind of understand why the similarities are there. In my doctoral thesis, I looked at letter writing and the use of ars dictaminis, and what surprised me in that, for example, is that men and women write and use the ars dictaminis in incredibly similar ways and manipulate it similarly, and like that had actually been quite unexpected from when I started it. Again, I don't know if that answers properly, but yeah.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions, but also 5 more minutes to go. So we have one more question live, and then, as I said, we'll say goodbye to everyone live streaming, and we can continue. So let me see if I can go back to, oops. So there is one, my screen, okay. So there is a question from Alberto to Anais. If you can clarify the point you made about law of succession and legal foundation that you were talking about.
Yes, so that's currently what I'm looking at as kind of my starting point for this. And I mean, essentially, I'm just piggying off the work of other people that have looked at each kingdom and kind of collating it together. But I'm just curious to see what if there were rules, if there was a law in place that allowed women to succeed or not. So, I mean, we all know the Salic law was kind of invoked later, wasn't actually what it was later claimed to be. So, you know, what was the legal foundation for allowing or disallowing women to the throne? In Navarre, the fueros are very clear and explicit that both women and men can inherit the throne. So it's basically just hopefully looking at all these various kingdoms and seeing how explicit or unclear the rules are, and what role the explicitness or lack thereof played in the success or failure of these women in securing or not, in successfully claiming the throne or not. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Anais. Fantastic. So we'll wrap up here for the live stream, and I would like to thank once again Paula and Anais for the fantastic talk. There were so many questions. We could have been here like chatting for another extra hour, but we're not, don't worry. So thank you, and thank you, Miriam, for hosting this, and thank you all for attending. We know how much intense online activity we all have going on these days. So a special thank you for all those of you who have attended this session and engaged so enthusiastically. So thank you very much for that.